Hello, everyone. I want to say Happy New Year again because it just feels like my year just started. Do you all remember this spread of my sketchbook where I talked about how I kind of trick myself into painting more? Where I print all these little images and do tiny little studies. No, don't take very long, like 20 minutes each, maybe 30 minutes. Well, before doing that spread, I had printed out probably 20 images and just kind of pick randomly from the pile. And a few of the images I had chosen were these situations where the sun is setting or rising and it's casting this long shadow across the landscape. I didn't choose to start with these because this is really challenging. My mind can't quite wrap around how to do this, but I want to be able to do it because I see this a lot, especially in the highlands, especially in the winter. There's not a lot of daylight, and it seems like half the day this is going on in the landscape. So I was like, okay, maybe later in January I'll tackle that challenge. So I have been. In my last video, I shared how I like to use dry brush technique, and I was also kind of leaning into this shadow idea, but not quite. The following week, on my own, I decided to paint this one, which was probably one of the most challenging in my bunch. I posted this one on Instagram a couple days ago, and it got such a positive feedback. I was surprised because when I look at it, I see all the flaws, but that's so normal. And I don't think I captured that feeling of the strong line of shadow as much as I wanted to. But I did learn a lot by doing that piece. And so I decided to tackle the next one, which is what you're watching today. As you can see, I'm doing two versions of this landscape, and there are things I like about each of them. In the end, you'll see and you can compare them and maybe let me know in the comments which one you like better. I personally like the second attempt, and Wolfie likes the first attempt. So, after going through this process multiple times, let me give you some tips about how to do this. And of course, it's going to vary based on your skill set and how familiar you are with gouache itself. Obviously, gouache is very finicky, and water control is a huge part of it. And from my last video, you've seen how I use the dry brush technique to do forests, and I'm definitely using the same technique in this piece. When it comes to layering, I think ideally you want to work from the background forward with gouache. I started with my tree line purely so that I could remember where my trees were, because a lot of times I'll paint my sky and it covers my drawing a little bit too much. And then I'm like, oh, where was I trying to put my big trees and my small trees? Blah, blah, blah. So I just did a really light version of my tree line. Then I dropped in my sky. The good thing about that is my sky kind of roughly covers some of the tops of the trees, and it makes those background trees appear even farther away because there's like that visual roughness, that texture that makes it a little more abstract. And that's good because we don't want things in the distance to be too detailed. It's better if they're much more simplified. And then what I found is that it's really helpful to paint in the shadow, the line of the shadow, before you even kind of render the trees at all. Paint that line of shadow across the whole piece, including the foreground below. And this color that you use should be the darkest dark of the piece. If you want the overall feeling of the piece to be a little bit lighter, like a bit softer, don't go super dark in this area. Keep it a little bit lighter. I didn't use black at all. I'm using blue / greenish purple as my dark in this piece. In the first attempt, I kept it lighter. In the second attempt, I went a smidge darker. As I said, I like the contrast of the second one, but yeah, it kind of depends on what feeling you're going for and the overall atmosphere you're trying to capture. Then once you have that base layer, you can let it dry, and then you can go back in and render the trees. Above the shadow line where the sun is hitting the tops of the trees, you want to maintain that line, that edge, I guess. So you don't want to paint light green on the entire tree. Just go down to where that shadow line is. I used a very muted green. I didn't add like phthalo or lemon yellow or really anything too intense, maybe just touches here and there of the lemon yellow, but I added a lot of white. And I also added red. This warms it up and it makes it especially look a little bit more sunny compared to the shadows, which are very blue. So you can play with the warm and the cool to make it even more dramatic. Some of the trees do need to be shadowy, so I did a few of them, especially in the distance, just purely with the lighter version of the shadow color. And that makes it look like the bigger trees are casting shadows behind them as well. And because the sun was coming from the left, I made sure the right side of the highlighted trees had a bit of shadow as well. The value of the shadows in the tree line, where, behind the sunny bit, it's a little bit lighter than what is below. So maybe just add a tiny bit more yellow or white and just bring it up slightly in value. Then that's going to make the shadows below and in the foreground feel a lot darker. One last thing about the highlights that I'll mention is it's kind of helpful to have just a few of them, a few maybe highlights on the edges of some of the branches, overlap the shadow line just a tiny bit so that it's not a perfectly straight line. It has to have a tiny bit of variation, but it should still be pretty uniform. And then in the shadows below, this is where I had the most fun. I had to make sure that my values didn't go really, really dark and really, really light. The values within the shadow area are very close together. So don't add too much white, don't add too much color. Stick with a base of blue or whatever your shadow color is, maybe purplish, greens, and then add just tiny, tiny, tiny hints of color or white. Go really slow, touch it on the paper, see how it dries, because a lot of times when you add white or really anything that's slightly diluted, it's going to dry a little bit darker. So it's really tricky to paint in that shadow area without, you have to be really patient because it takes a while for it to dry so you can actually see the final value of what you've put down. So yeah, I just kind of put some music on and zoned out a little bit and just was very patient, lots of little touches and then waiting. That was probably what took the longest in the entire painting because I had to put the paint down, let it dry, see if it dried light enough or dark enough, and then move on. I did add variation in like the textures, like I added some rocks, I added some branches and little bushes and stuff. It's very minimal, it's very minor. You can't really see a lot of the variation when you're doing the pathway and maybe any fallen trees or bushes. It's helpful to add just a hint of red or brown and keeping the values very similar to what's there already, but still just that tiny bit of warmth helps differentiate those subjects in the shadows. If there's a tree or a bush that starts down in the shadows and grows up into the highlight line, I usually would add just a hint more white or yellow just to make it really pop and make that difference between the highlight and the shadow stand out even more. I don't necessarily love the composition of this piece at all, but it was a really good reference to practice this shadow technique with. I have a few more images that I'm going to be playing with, as I said, so I guess I'll share the result of those on Instagram or on my blog or something. I think to make it a little more interesting, a little more appealing to me, I would like to have maybe some hills or mountains in the distance. I think that could add just another level of interest to it. But yeah, it was fun and I learned a ton. Okay, I know some of you are probably thinking, Sarah, why are we seeing so many trees? Are you tree daft? And yeah, I do love trees. I walk in the forest almost every day. It's been one of my biggest inspirations since I started as an artist, and I just can't get enough of painting trees. They're an endlessly fascinating subject in all different seasons, in all different lighting. So it's my go-to comfort subject, and I learn so much by painting and drawing trees. Plus, over on my Patreon, this has been Tree Month. I'm doing monthly themes to kind of help keep us organized, to add a little bit more structure to the yearly curriculum. And I, posted a big, long, detailed post about how to draw trees from basic shapes all the way up to more detailed. And then I did a tutorial where I showed everyone how to paint these trees with gouache. It was so fun, and I absolutely love seeing all the varied results from everyone who painted along with me. So yes, this month has been very tree heavy. I'll put a link in the description if you want to head over to my Patreon and check out all this awesome tree content. I also just did a live stream this past weekend where I was drawing trees. It was super casual, very chatty. I'm laughing because I was rambling a lot, but that's kind of normal for me. But if you want to have something on in the background while you work, that would be a great option because we were just geeking out about trees and drawing tools and all sorts of stuff. It was like 2.5 hours, so you can have it on while you're painting or drawing or doing the dishes, or I don't know. I'll put a link to that stream in the chat as well. Okie dokie, I'm gonna head out now. Thanks everyone for watching. I hope this inspired you to go paint some trees, and I will see you again next time. Take care.